Hello, and welcome to the Fiction Nonfiction podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your social media feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm V.V. Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the novel Brotherless Night.
And I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
So, Whit, we're going to have to be kind of careful this episode.
With what? With each other? I don't really understand. It's the end of the semester, man. It's hard to be careful about anything. I'm just careful about getting my grades in now that Canvas has crashed. What's the reason for the care?
We're going to be talking about treason, which is a hot button topic in some administrations these days.
You're doing treason or something? I'm not. I don't have time for treason right now. I've got other things to do. I can't. Treason seems kind of like it takes a lot of time.
I mean, we're gonna go back and look at historical treason, totally in the past, so it'll probably be fine, right?
What? You're going back in time and going to do some treason backwards in time, or I just don't. I'm a little nervous about treason, just in general, as a thing these days, given how our president seems to think everyone's committing treason. Little context,
ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, come back and listen to this episode later, and you will see the moment when Whitney gave me the idea for my third novel. Sugi goes back in time and commits treason. But today, we're going to be talking about one of the most infamous alleged traitors in history, Anne Boleyn, with our guest, Rebecca Lehmann. Rebecca is a novelist and the author of 3 collections of poetry, Between the Crack-Ups, Ringer, winner of the AWP Donald Hall Prize, and The Sweating Sickness. Her writing has appeared in American Poetry Review, the Kenyon Review, NPR's The Slowdown, and the Academy of American Poets Poem a Day. She holds an MFA in poetry from the Iowa Writers Workshop and a PhD in creative writing from Florida State. She lives in Indiana, where she is Associate Professor of English and Gender and Women's Studies at St. Mary's College. She's joining us today to discuss her debut novel, a speculative history about Anne Boleyn called The Beheading Game. Rebecca, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sugi. Thanks so much for having me.
The old beheading game. I haven't played that game, fortunately.
I would advise against that one.
So this book is a fantastical retelling of the execution of Anne Boleyn, where instead of remaining dead after having played, or at least Henry VIII playing the beheading game on her, she comes back to life and seeks revenge against him. The book is full of historical figures and events. So could you just give us a little detail about the history behind Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII and the political machinations behind her execution for listeners who might not be up to date?
Yeah, sure. So Anne Boleyn is the second wife of Henry VIII. There are 6 of them. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived is the rhyme that British school children learn to tell them apart. So she's one of the beheadeds. And she marries Henry VIII after 7 long years of chaste courtship while he was trying to extricate himself from his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon. She has a really meteoric rise in power as they're courting and as she is like rising up and about to become queen. And they're married for only 3 years. She gives birth to 1 child who goes on to become Queen Elizabeth I and then has a series of miscarriages. During the 3 years, Henry's opinion of her starts to change, and there are a lot of debates among historians about why this happens. But in 1536, she is accused of treason, adultery, and incest, arrested, tried for those crimes, and then executed in the Tower of London.
This novel is threaded with true historical facts, well-known figures, some well-traveled ground, including ground that other novelists have also touched. But in some places, your novel, of course, expands and dramatizes aspects of Anne's history. Anne is so interesting for what we know about her and also for what we don't. So what aspects of her background felt ripe for expansion, and how did you go about thinking about that?
Yeah, I thought so much about how to characterize Anne. in this novel. Obviously, this is a novel that takes some really wild, imaginative leaps. Like Anne Boleyn comes back after her execution. She wakes up, she sews her head back on, she tries to kill Henry VIII. But I wanted to try to get her character right. Unfortunately, because Anne Boleyn was kind of like a target of this really focused and, in my opinion, misogynistic political persecution. After her execution, a lot of her writing was destroyed. A lot of information about her was destroyed. Like all of the portraits of her were destroyed. So there's kind of like a blank spot when it comes to Anne Boleyn. We know some information about her through what other people said about her. There's a very small amount of her writing that survives. But I remember when I was researching the novel, listening to a Tudor podcast where a historian said something like, she's kind of like a Rorschach test. Like when you're looking at her, so much is unknown that you see in her what you want to see, or what you see in her might reflect something about yourself. And so, like, this is a pretty feminist retelling, and that probably reflects my own feminist viewpoints on the subject matter to a certain extent. But there is enough research out there and enough that exists about her out there in the historical record that I felt pretty confident making her a very smart woman, making her an intellectual in the novel. I think she's often miscast in history as this really flat, two-dimensional, oversexed homewrecker who seduces Henry VIII, breaks up his marriage, and then gets what she deserves when she's ultimately beheaded. But you don't have to research very hard at all to find out that there was a lot more to her. She was really politically savvy. She spoke multiple languages. She was a religious reformer and really active in like the run-up to the Protestant Reformation in Britain. So I wanted to get all of that into her character in the novel. So she's a pretty, like, she's kind of in her head. She's pretty intellectual. She's also a little snobby in the novel, which I think is true to her character as well. She was somebody who had a very high opinion of herself and probably had not ever had to work very hard in the way that like the common people of England would have been working during this time period in her life. So I didn't want to make her, just like this two-dimensional hero either. I wanted to have some of what were her flaws show through. I think that what people think of as being Anne Boleyn's flaws are things like promiscuity, which there's no factual basis for. I think what her actual flaws were was that she was like a little bit of an elitist, and also had a bad temper. But I don't know, like temper is one of those things that I think when we talk about temper a lot of times reads different when it's a woman with a temper than when it's a man with a temper. And I thought a lot about that stuff when I was writing the Beheading Game too. Like, how do these characteristics that Anne has read, and how are we reading them differently because she's a woman than we would if she was a man?
I want to rewind for a second to something you said about, us not knowing very much about what she looks like, because you and I were trading messages a little bit before this interview, and you sent me this article from the BBC about a potential sketch of Anne, which has been discovered very recently. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I know that this is a podcast where you often talk about current events, and this is a current event related to Anne Boleyn, although she lived almost 500 years ago. These researchers in the UK have combed through. So there was this painter named Hans Holbein who was at the court of Henry VIII and did portraits of a lot of the kind of like big players in the court. So like that famous portrait of Henry VIII where he's standing with his hands on his hips and he's kind of old and pudgy and just looks very big, is a Hans Holbein portrait. And he did portraits of like Thomas Cromwell and Thomas More and a lot of these big figures. He also left behind, as painters do, a lot of sketches because he was, sketching people at court and then assembling sketches so he could do these complex and really intricate portraits. And there are a lot of them that have been just sort of like a question mark, like they're not labeled, who is in the sketch. There is one sketch of a woman that has written across the top Queen Anne Boleyn, but there's like wide consensus that it's probably not actually Anne Boleyn because the woman in this sketch has blonde hair and Anne Boleyn was a brunette with dark eyes. And that's something that people do know about her fairly certainly. So there's like, speculation on whether the woman in that sketch is Anne Boleyn's mother, Elizabeth Howard, or like whether the words Queen Anne Boleyn were written on the sketch later at some later date. Anyway, uh, so these researchers in the UK used, I guess, facial recognition software to go through all of the Holbein sketches, and they compared the bone structure in the sketches because he's a very realistic painter, to other portraits of like Elizabeth and sketches of Elizabeth and pictures of Anne Boleyn's mother to try to like see if there was a sketch of Anne Boleyn anywhere in here. And they found a sketch that they think is Anne Boleyn, which is really exciting. I don't know that they can say with certainty that it's her, but it's a very like in my opinion, it's a very like entrancing portrait of a woman, like sketch of a woman. She's just kind of like looking straight on at the viewer. She has a very like plain, maybe almost like slightly fed up expression on her face. And it's just kind of exciting news in the Tudor world because there's been this big mystery around what Anne looks like. There are two portraits that were painted, or I think a handful of portraits that were painted during Elizabeth's lifetime, her daughter's lifetime, that most scholars agree probably look like her, but they were not painted when Anne Boleyn was still alive. So it's kind of a question mark. And this new sketch has some resemblance to those portraits for sure. But also is just like, it's so well drawn. It really looks like, sometimes those portraits from the era, there's so much like paint and you can't really get a good idea of what the person would have looked like. But this sketch almost looks like the woman could just step out of the sketch and start talking to you.
Rebecca, I'm going to ask you to do so. Actually, right now, you're better. I wanted to ask you to center yourself in your frame a little bit more, but you've been a little bit over on this side, and like if you just no, yeah, the other way, yeah. But
This way.
pretty,
Okay.
yeah, like that. There you go. Because we use
Okay.
an AI tool to take the face out and do shorts later when we do the video on YouTube, and it's easy
Got it.
if you're right in the middle there. All right, I'm going to count back in and. Sugi,
Okay.
I'm going to
Whitney,
go
I think you could-
reading, okay?
I was going to say, please.
Yeah. All right. 3, 2, 1. So you can consider me a person who is very inexpert in the Tudor world, as you've been framing it. So I have just one question. Is like, I'm assuming that the charges against her were bullshit?
Yeah, yes. If that isn't clear, if that hasn't been clear from what I've been saying, yeah, most scholars today agree these charges were almost certainly false against her. And so like I think a bigger question is like, why was she charged with these crimes if she didn't do these things and if there wasn't really any good evidence? And the leading theories on that are like, one, she hadn't given birth to a son, and Henry VIII really wanted a male heir, and she was in her mid 30s, most likely. Record keeping for women's birthdays wasn't great during this time period, but she was probably 35 when she was executed. So it was faster for Henry VIII to execute her than to try to go through the divorce process again and spend another 7 years trying to divorce another woman. But I think also she made a lot of political enemies at court. And so, like people's patience for her as a kind of unmanageable woman who didn't fit gender stereotypes of the time or gender expectations at the time that women be submissive and obedient and meek had, I think, just kind of run thin. Unfortunately for her. And I think, also like we now have the benefit of 500 years of history. So when we look at Henry VIII and see he burned through 6 wives and countless mistresses and also had a bunch of his friends and counselors executed, it's pretty clear that he's the problem.
It is interesting to be reminded at how monstrous these kings were. Now, but we'd love to have you read a passage about Anne and give us some sense of her personality and motivations as she appears in the book. Could you do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to read a little bit from one of the early chapters, just to give a little bit of context first. This chapter happens after Anne has escaped from the Tower of London. So she wakes up, her head is at her knees. She's not really sure how she has come back to life in the novel. That never gets explained. So she has her own theories about what might be happening, including that maybe this is some kind of like religious resurrection that she's experiencing based on her deep Christian faith and like what she knows about death and resurrection in Christianity. But she wakes up, she escapes the Tower of London, she flees to the southern bank of the Thames, in an area called Southwark that now is part of London, but at the time was this kind of like seedy southern suburb where prostitution was like, kind of tacitly legal, and bear baitings happened. And this is where like Shakespeare's Globe ultimately was located. So it was where people from London went to cut loose and have a good time. She escapes to there, steals a sewing basket, sews her head back on, and then kind of like sets out to figure out what to do next. And at the end of her first day coming back from the dead, she meets a young man outside of an arena, and there's a big crowd pushing into this arena. So she goes with the flow and goes into the crowd, and she walks into a bear baiting. So I'm going to read a little passage from the end of this chapter where the bear baiting is happening. Just a little bit of a content warning. There is a little bit of animal violence here, and it's probably unnecessary to say this, but I would like to just make clear that I don't condone animal violence or bear baiting before I dive into this. Okay. So this is kind of like the bear has really had a hard time, and it's clear that the bear is probably going to die soon at this point. During all of this, the bear paced and snarled in the arena, turning its head to the sounds of the musicians, to the cheers of the crowd scrambling for the bread, every now and then getting whipped by the men standing in the corners. This bear is a terror, thought Anne, though it is blind and lame. In its injuries and age, it is more dangerous, more reckless, ready to bite anything that crosses its path, untamable though the men may think they've tamed it. For a moment, the bear turned its head toward Anne, and its sightless black eyes looked both at and past her. Then it swung its head at the lash of a whip from one of the corners, seized hold of the whip in its jaw, and pulled. The man wielding the whip must have wound it around his arm, because when the bear pulled the whip, the man flew off his stool over the wooden partition and into the arena. The bear flung its head from side to side, whip clamped firmly in its jaws, and the man, whip wound round his arm, flew side to side too. At first, the man screamed in agony as his arm dislocated from his shoulder, then broke, and his head hit the dirt floor again and again. Then his screams stopped, and he went limp, his eyes half closed. The gate on the wall of the octagon swung open, and the barker rushed out with a sword, followed by the other 7 whipping men who'd stood in the corners, who now held ropes and daggers. The whipping men swung the ropes around the bear's neck to try to hold it back, to try to save the 8th man, who lay limp at the feet of the bear, still tethered to his whip, which by now the beast had dropped. With determination, the barker came upon the bear and drove his sword into the beast's chest. The bear howled in pain, and blood poured from its mouth. The 7 whipping men in turn jabbed their daggers into the bear's sides, and the barker withdrew his sword with much effort and drove it into the bear's soft flank, twisted and turned it, and then the bear stopped moving and collapsed. The crowd roared its approval, and Anne roared too, rising to her feet with the rest of the spectators, arms held above her head, hands and fists cheering. The voice that came out of her throat was a bellow, low and caked with dust. She knew then that she must kill Henry, that he was wild and wounded, like the bear, that he was untamable, that he would hurt others, including Elizabeth, that though others might think they could control him, they could not. She must kill Henry, and she must do it before he hurried to marry Jane, before he could father another heir who would stand in competition to Elizabeth and threaten her safety. This was the only way to protect Elizabeth, who would be safest if she sat on the throne, the king's legal heir, and the only way to protect England, for Elizabeth could make a better country, a country not beholden to Rome, not ministered to by a corrupt and decadent church, not governed by men only interested in fattening their own coffers. Elizabeth could carry on where Anne had been forced to leave off. Anne cheered the bloodied men who'd slain the bear, and when the young man next to her embraced her and kissed her on the mouth, she kissed him back, for she was alive and powerful and filled with purpose.
Thank you very much. So, uh, you know, it didn't happen that she sewed her head back on. This is
Sadly,
I do know
no.
this much, even though I'm not an expert in Tudor world.
And this is how you guys break it to me.
I really wish I could have written that into being, but try as I might, it did not actually happen.
But it's an interesting way of rethinking the story, and I wondered if there are other fantastical aspects of the story. I wonder if you could talk about those and like what led you to that original decision. I mean, obviously the book can't happen right without that decision. So
I thought a lot about, I knew I wanted to write a novel that dove into Anne Boleyn's story in more detail, and that tried to give her an ending that I felt was more deserved by her, like a different end than the one she had, which just seems so blatantly unjust. And I thought a lot about different ways to do that. Like I could have had her escape the tower before she's executed, or I could have had her, like she had a couple different proposals come in while Henry was courting her. She could have married one of those men, or I thought about like setting the story forward in time, and having her have access to more resources. But ultimately, I decided that I wanted to keep the beheading in the story because I think one of the things that really resonates about Anne Boleyn across 500 years of history is she's an example of this woman who was really intelligent and had this really meteoric rise in power and ascended to a certain height and then was brutally punished by a patriarchal system for that power. Like the beheading is kind of this crystallization of this state-sponsored patriarchy that comes for Anne Boleyn. And I didn't want to take that out and defang the beast because I think that that's something that people, and particularly women, recognize even today in the story of Anne Boleyn. Like, thankfully, we're not still seeing women like in the UK being beheaded for like being too powerful. But I also think we could all think of some modern parallels of women that like ascend to a certain level of power and then have these really steep and precipitous falls. So I wanted to keep it in, and I thought about how to do that. And there's a long tradition of what are called head carrier stories, where characters are beheaded and then continue living afterwards. The one that is referenced by the title of the Beheading Game and in the novel is the story of Gawain and the Green Knight from Arthurian legend, where this magical Green Knight shows up, and Gawain, the young upstart knight, beheads him, and then the Green Knight picks up his head afterwards and just kind of like walks off in an enchanted way. But there's also the legend of Sleepy Hollow in North America, or there's a whole like line of what are called cephalophore saint stories where saints are beheaded mid-sermon usually, and then they pick up the head and the head keeps preaching a lot of the time. And so I just thought like, well, why can't Anne Boleyn do that? Like she could have done that too. I could not stop thinking about the idea once it crossed my mind. So I sat down and wrote the first chapter and I thought, I think that this could work, but she has her head off. I got it back on her pretty quickly because I was really worried when I was writing it. Like it was a lot to try to write a character whose head is held in their hands in front of them. Just from a narrative perspective, like you have to mention every time they're looking at something, they have to physically turn the head. And then even though I was in total control as the author of this book, I was very worried that she was going to drop her head in the river. As the story was going on. So I was happy when she sewed it back on and kept going. But that, like I said, it's never really explained in the novel. And there are some other kind of like enchanted magical realism-ish elements that pop up throughout the Beheading Game. Without giving too much about the book away, there are a couple of moments as the book goes on that kind of seem like, are they magic? Are they just great coincidence? And then at the end, there's another kind of fantastical thing that happens to Anne at the conclusion of the book.
So, as we can hear in your answers, I mean, you did, and I remember when you were doing this, like a massive amount of research. There's like the bear
Yeah.
baiting. I mean, I remember you planning your trips to England.
Yes, yes.
And
I remember texting you about about that to see if you had any like tips for places to go when I was not touring Tudor sites.
and I mean, I learned a lot about England from your trips there, your questions where I was like, I have no idea. And so like even these choices of that are not realistic are informed by the research. And then we do also hear, and we're taping, I should say, listeners, on Friday, May 8th, and Sunday is Mother's Day. And like one of the
Yeah.
big threads in this book is, Anne wanting to keep Elizabeth safe, as we hear in the passage. And can you talk about how motherhood drives this narrative?
Yeah, so Anne's goal of getting to Henry in the novel, she wants to get to him before he can marry Jane Seymour, and kill him before he can produce a rival heir. In real life, Henry VIII marries Jane Seymour 11 days after Anne Boleyn's execution, and they announce their engagement the next day. He had been engaged in a months-long chaste affair with Jane Seymour that Anne was aware of and angry about. So I think like if you didn't already think that the charges were false, that's some pretty damning evidence that this man may have been full of shit if he's like got the next wife lined up in the wings as he is executing wife number two. But I really wanted to think about Anne as a mother. So her motivation in trying to get to Henry is that she wants to protect Elizabeth's claim to the throne. I think that the fact that Anne Boleyn was a mother and was the mother to Queen Elizabeth often drops out of her story and almost becomes like a little footnote because it doesn't gel with the idea that a lot of people have of Anne Boleyn as this promiscuous person, which is not even a factually based assumption about her. But nonetheless, I feel like people struggle to reconcile those two things. Like, I don't know where they think babies come from, but she was a mother and she was a really devoted mother to her daughter. And I wanted to think about that in the beheading game. In the same way, I think that Anne Boleyn kind of drops out of Elizabeth I's story as well, or becomes just this little footnote. Like Elizabeth I becomes queen after both of her siblings have been crowned monarch and passed away, and she's like entering into this kind of dicey political time where she can't really be like, yeah, my dad was a real jerk who executed my mom, and I think my mom was probably right. She has to kind of keep her love for her mother secret, but there is a lot of evidence that Elizabeth was really interested in Anne Boleyn. For example, she wore this locket ring throughout her life that had a portrait of herself on one side and a portrait of her mother on the other side, which I found to be a really touching detail. So I knew I wanted to pull in this thread of motherhood. Like all royalty in England at the time, Elizabeth was separated from her parents when she was a baby. This was just like a customary thing that would happen in royal families. So she's taken away and given her own household when she's like 3 or 4 months old. And Anne and Henry get updates on her. But Anne was very concerned with her. And one detail that I found really heartbreaking when I was researching for the book is that one of the last things that Anne Boleyn did when she was in the Tower of London awaiting her trial was to order clothing for her daughter for the coming seasons. As a parent myself, I found that to just be such a like relatable detail. Like, you know, I'm not royalty and it's 500 years later, but I still worry about whether my kids are going to have like the right size shoe or enough shorts for summer, or will like if I buy them uniform pants, will they have enough to make it through the school year? It just to me spoke to how for Anne Boleyn, probably the last thing that she was thinking about when she stepped up to that scaffold was her daughter, Elizabeth. This is part of the reason, for example, that like her execution speech is not like a giant rail against Henry VIII. Like it's a fairly compliant execution speech. She doesn't admit to any wrongdoing, but she also says something about Henry like, she hopes that he lives a long time and that he's been a just and kind monarch to her, which, like, of course, is just not true. But she's really trying to butter him up so that he doesn't like cast Elizabeth all the way off after her death.
I, you know, this is a political podcast as well as a literary podcast, and we talk about contemporary political events. I am concerned about the fact that everything reminds me of Trump. It's probably part of the spell that Trump is casting upon us these days. But it's hard not to think of Trump and the way that he treats his cabinet members as less like, important officials and sort of like pawns and political scapegoats in the way that Henry uses Anne. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on the role of of scapegoats in conserving political power historically and now.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I wrote The Beheading Game and sold it while Joe Biden was president. And I remember thinking at the time, maybe I've leaned a little too hard into the feminist rage. Like maybe I certainly had Trump's first term on my mind a little bit while I was writing the novel. But I thought well, now that's over. And then of course he came back into power and some of the elements of the beheading game that I had worried were maybe too over the top seemed newly relevant. I don't um I think there are a lot of differences between Henry VIII and Donald Trump, but I do think that you see the same pattern of a person who uses people for what they are worth and then very quickly pivots away from them. Which is like a pattern that Henry VIII showed when dealing with his wives, but also when dealing with other associates like Thomas More or Thomas Cromwell, both of whom end up executed while Henry VIII is king, but who had been like some of his chief advisors, or even a figure like Cardinal Wolsey, who had also been one of Henry's like biggest advisors. He doesn't get executed, but he's arrested and treated so poorly that he dies shortly after being arrested. I think that looking at like the contemporary Trump cabinet, it is a little bit appalling how quickly he burns through people. And it's notable that he is rapidly dismissing the women in his cabinet. I don't agree politically with the women that he's dismissing, but I also feel like it's a distinct pattern that's now happening.
Yeah, so he's fired three members of his cabinet, Kristi Noem, and then Pam Bondi and Lori Chavez-Dreamer. And he also uses this rhetoric of treason, right? In recent weeks, he has said that Obama should be arrested for treason and that Clinton should be.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing that I respond to is that he's willing to make shit up about people in order to get them out of his way to do what he wants and then formalize it through a sort of fake legal proceeding, in which the charges aren't really accurate or even fair.
Yeah, it's very like you slept with your brother George.
To have happened with James Comey, and that
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that does ring some bells to Henry VIII and his behavior, and the kind of like kangaroo court that happened when Anne Boleyn was tried. Accusing her of adultery, but then not just like adultery with other noble people, but adultery with a court musician and then adultery with her own brother. It's just so ridiculously out of left field that it becomes unbelievable. But I think that people in the Tudor era were so afraid of coming under Henry VIII's ire that they complied. And I certainly see some echoes of that to the present day as well. It seems like there's a lot of fear about being the person who has the Trump focus on you and having that national anger of the hard right conservatives focused intensely on you. Like it scares people. And so they're complying in advance, I think.
So even within this sphere, right, like Trump has run three times. He only lost against Biden. And then you've got Anne, who is right. Like we haven't actually said, like Anne was a politician.
She was. I think that often gets overlooked about her, but she was a really shrewd political actor. Yeah.
And Yet the Anne of your book, I'm dancing around some spoilers here. The Anne of your book succeeds in wielding political power in a really interesting way. And I wonder if you can just think about can you say a little bit about how you see political power by women being wielded then and now? Like what you saw about that in your research and how you think about it when we are looking at, I don't know, the women on the other side of the political aisle or the women who are clinging to political power within the Trump administration.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to be a woman in politics and to be taken seriously. And I don't think it matters which side of the aisle you're on. I was so disappointed both times that a woman was recently running for president and was not elected. And to hear from the left wing, people say things like, I'd vote for a woman, but not that woman, or I just don't like her and I can't put my finger on why, or a million other reasons why Hillary Clinton or Kamala Harris might not have been an acceptable choice. And, you know, it seems like to me there's a heavy element of misogyny going on both sides of the aisle. I think it's probably worse on the right hand side of the aisle and among conservatives, but I don't think that it's great on the left either. I mean, it concerns me that women only seem to be able to hit a certain level of political power in the United States. And I don't know. I mean, I think women certainly have more power now than they did 500 years ago in Tudor England, but I think that you can draw some comparisons. I mean, there's a whole like segment of the manosphere right now that's arguing that women shouldn't be able to vote, for example. And while those arguments sound absurd, the more times they're repeated, the more likely they are to come out of an actual politician's mouth, and the more likely they are to drift toward what we now call the center. And that language reminds me so much of this sort of like women aren't even people misogyny of Tudor England.
Rebecca, thanks so much for joining us today. Listeners, be sure to pick up a copy of The Beheading Game at an independent bookseller near you.
Thanks so much for having me. It was lovely to chat.